Okay, we're actually into chapter 23, which is about two things really. Number one, the French Revolution, and then thereafter, the Wars of Napoleon, or the Napoleonic Wars, you might say. Now, the time frame on this chapter, so it'll be sections 1 through 4, will definitely partake into the late 1700s and early 1800s. That's what we're taking a look at, 1789 to about 1815. One of the things that you have to really understand is that there were some underlying issues in France. Even though France was really one of the most powerful countries in the world, and definitely the most powerful country in Europe during the 1700s, it did have many underlying issues. Some of them included poor harvests, so agricultural troubles, inflation, and also high taxation for the general population. One of the things you need to take a look at as well is something in France called the Old Order. And sometimes this is kind of put into play in history as a social class system or a division of social classes. This was known as the Old Regime. It's basically the social and political system of France during and up to the 1770s. It's kind of the way that things were run in France. And during this time period, France was actually divided up into three actually very large social classes that they called estates. We're going to take a look at how some of these estates or social classes had more power and an easier route to freedom and rights than did other classes. And so we're going to take a look at the first estate, which was made up of the Catholic Church clergy. So when you're taking a look at this, you're talking about bishops, you're talking about cardinals high up in the church. The second estate is actually made up of rich nobles. These are the first and second estates, okay? They hold the most power. They generally do not agree with Enlightenment ideas. They don't want much change. One of the reasons for that is because the church really was against skepticism. They didn't want people questioning what they were teaching. And for good reason there. They wanted to keep things in a normal state. They wanted to have their followers continue to believe in what they were preaching. And so I can understand that. And the second estate, the rich nobles, obviously they want to keep their wealth and power. They don't really want to give that up at all. So these two groups are really, they're not interested in Enlightenment ideas. They actually would rather suppress Enlightenment ideas than, of course, foster them. The third estate, which comes into play here, is actually the vast majority of people in France. It makes up 97% of the overall population. It was actually divided up into three separate groups. First off was the middle class, also known as the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie would include people like bankers, factory owners, merchants, skilled artisans. So they had some wealth, okay? They had skill and they had wealth. The second grouping within that third estate are the workers. The workers were really the poorest group in France as far as the groups that actually earn an income. They were tradespeople, apprentices, laborers, and domestic servants. And you also have peasants. The peasants would make up actually the largest group of the third estate, but they are still working basically on the land of nobles. Oftentimes, they don't get a worker's wage, but instead they get food, shelter, and protection from the lords of the manor. Now, one thing I would say is the lower classes of the third estate, especially the workers and the peasants, they resented the upper estates and they wanted change. They're the ones who are pushing Enlightenment ideas. They're the ones who are gravitating to those changes that the Enlightenment may bring about. Now, what we'll take a look at here is a quick picture that kind of resembles what was going on in France during this time. Okay, so here you see a pie graph of the population. You'll see that the first estate, the Catholic Church clergy, made up less than 1%. The second estate, which were the nobles, they made up about 2%. And then the third estate, 97% there. The first estate on this chart, remember, made up of the clergy of the Roman Catholic Church. They were against Enlightenment ideas. The second estate were made up of the wealthy nobles. They held the highest office in government. They disagreed also about Enlightenment ideas. The third estate included those groups that I sort of talked to you about here a second ago. They really didn't have much power in government. They did embrace Enlightenment ideas, and they definitely resented, almost hated, the wealthy first and second estates. If you can look over here, you see that taxation. The nobles, the wealthiest people in the country, they paid 0% tax. The Catholic Church clergy at least paid 2% of the overall taxes. And then the third estate actually paid 50% of their income went to taxes. So you're really placing a very high burden on that third estate. This is an example. The old person here with the walking cane and bent over backwards is representing the third estate because they're carrying the most burden of taxation, and the first and second estate are kind of riding on top of the third estate there. So as you can see from those diagrams and graphs, there really was a big push for change, and that change came in the factor of Enlightenment ideas. What you have here are new ideas about government, some of the economic problems that we discussed, and really actually poor leadership, creating a strong desire for change in France. Also, the American Revolution happening about 15 years before the French Revolution, many people in France were actually inspired by the success of the American Revolution in the overthrow of British control in what is now the United States. Economic troubles, let's talk a little bit about that. These economic troubles began in the 1780s. One of the things happened is that the economic standpoint of France began to decline due to heavy taxation and also a high cost of living. A high cost of living means that in the area that you live, the amount for housing is very high. For example, in today's world, gas prices might be high, real estate, so on and so forth. Everything is, even the prices at stores could sometimes be a little higher in certain areas over others. Agricultural troubles begin to set in, and also poor harvests. This leads to many problems. And then there's government debt that were, a lot of it actually, the French helped the American Revolution. A lot of their debt was really in the fact that they sent huge loans to the American Revolution for help there. All of this was actually compounded by the fact that from 1770 to 1790, the king and queen, King Louis XVI and his queen Marie Antoinette, they caused a great deal of debt with extravagant spending. Louis XVI actually inherited debt from the spending of previous kings, and as I said earlier, created more debt by borrowing money to support the American Revolution, which actually came back to haunt the French because the success of the American Revolution ended up leading to the French Revolution. So we have a weak leader here in Louis XVI. Actually was known as an indecisive procrastinator. It meant that he took a great deal of time to make decisions and then, of course, put off a lot of decisions when they should have been made much quicker. He was known to not pay much attention to his advisors, and most people say he was actually more concerned with how he looked than how he actually ruled. His wife, Marie Antoinette, a lot of famous movies about her in recent times. She was never really liked well in France because she was of Austrian royalty, and Austria and France have been bitter enemies. It's the Habsburg family versus the Bourbon family. She spent actually enormous amounts of money on gowns, jewels, gambling, and gifts. They called her Madame Deficit, meaning this lady's running up the deficit, the government debt. Now, Louis does have a problem with funding, and he wants to impose a new tax on the nobles. This was actually a great idea because if you look at that earlier graph that we showed, the nobles did not pay any percentage of income into taxes. And so I think that this was actually a good decision by him, but the second estate actually forced him to call a meeting from all three estates, which was called the Estates General in 1789, and they were going to put this new tax onto a vote. And one of the things about the Estates General is all three estates send their delegates there, but they only are allowed to cast one single vote per estate. So even though the third estate had 97% of the population, they really could only voice one vote. And the first and second estates, they don't really want much change. So they're kind of buddy-buddy, and they're always going to be able to have the advantage 2 votes to 1. And on this tax, they are going to vote no, whereas the third estate would likely vote yes. So what happens here is this really leads us into the start of the French Revolution. The medieval rules stated that each estate would have to meet in separate rooms and they could cast one cumulative vote. Therefore, the first and second estate, they would always talk before going into vote. They would pre-decide on what they wanted to vote and then therefore outnumber the third estate to keep the lower classes down where they are. In this particular vote, though, the third estate actually wanted to break the rules, and they motioned that they should have all delegates meet in the same room to vote, and each individual delegate would have a vote. And this would give the third estate the advantage. They have the most delegates because they have the highest population. Now, Louis XVI nixed the idea. He said, nope, the Estates General must run by the rules. One member of the first estate, actually a clergyman named Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, actually supported the third estate and said that they should form what he called a National Assembly. The National Assembly would essentially separate from the French body. They would pass laws and create reforms in the name of the French people, meaning the 97%. On June 17, 1789, the Third Estate voted to become the National Assembly. They broke away from the absolute monarchy. It was the basic first act of the revolution, and it was a declaration of a republican form of government. Eventually, they were locked out of their meeting room on subsequent days, and they met in the tennis court on the Palace of Versailles. It was an indoor court, by the way, and they vowed to remain there until they could draft a new constitution. Nobles and clergymen who agreed with the Third Estate joined in with them. There were some, and these actions forced Louis XVI to get his national army ready. So what you have here is the tennis court oath. You've got these acts of revolution. You've got the monarch getting ready to defend his ideology there. And what takes place next is a very historic event in French history. It's called the storming of the Bastille. The people of Paris, they start to see that the French army is being mobilized against them, and they are starting to get themselves ready. They form mobs. They begin gathering weapons to defend themselves against a possible attack from the military. In search of guns and ammo, the mobs attacked a fortified French prison called the Bastille. The mob overthrew the prison guards. They actually killed several with the weapons that they had stolen. And the fall of the Bastille has become a very symbolic act of revolution for the French. This all took place on July 14, 1789. Today in France, they celebrate Bastille Day. It's a national holiday, very similar to what we celebrate on the 4th of July in the United States of America. This is a painting here of the storming of the Bastille. You can see that there's a lot of chaos going on in the French streets. This is what the Bastille generally looked like. It's a prison. It was housing former prisoners, and this place they thought would be an excellent spot to be able to gather the weapons of the prison guards. That was the whole idea of storming the Bastille. Now, the Great Fear is something that began to spread during this time from Paris to the countrysides. The Great Fear was basically rumors about the military and nobles attacking peasants and causing great panic and paranoia. Peasants began to arm themselves. They started to overthrow their own nobles and free themselves from the state of serfdom. The type of weapons that they were using were basic farm tools, pitchforks, shovels, things of that nature. In 1789, actually, a mob of angry women armed with knives, axes, and other household weapons marched on the Palace of Versailles to force the king and queen out of the palace and back to Paris to do work. The women were actually extremely angry about the price of bread at the time. And Marie Antoinette says, well, if they can't afford bread, let them eat cake, which, whether or not she said that, has become a symbolic statement of really an unrealistic understanding of what the general population might be going through during this time span, where she's living in this palace and they're scrounging for loaves of bread. The women were actually very successful in this attempt. They killed a few of the guards at the Palace of Versailles, and they literally did force the king and queen back to the city of Paris, which signaled a change in power for France. The forces of revolution were now in play. Thank you.